Welcome to the panel on inclusion in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. This panel will explore the themes of ostracization that are developed in Frankenstein. It will also serve as an homage to Mary Shelley, whose personal experience as a female author in the early 19th century informed the work as we know it today. Born to William Godwin and esteemed feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft, Shelley was exposed to the intellectual and scientific community from a young age. The influence of Galvanism and advances in modern medicine inspired Victor Frankenstein's experiments, as they were written in the book. And in the first publication of the novel in 1818, the name on the spine was only Shelley. So many assumed that her husband, the poet Percy Shelley, was the author. In 1831, Mary Shelley would publish a revised edition with how she came to conceive of the work, dispelling any doubts that she was the true author. Her need to claim her work as her own is not uncommon with ostracized communities in the science fields. So with that brief introduction, I would like to welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Nyote Calixte, Dr. Bryan Batch, and Dr. Ann West, to say a few words of background about themselves and their work. So start off telling us briefly about your journey, an obstacle you faced, and a piece of advice you wish you would have had.
So should we just stop? Okay.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Sorry, the microphone is intimidating here. I'm Dr. Bryan Batch. I'm an adult endocrinologist here at Duke, and I'm really happy to be here. And especially happy that I was introduced to the forum and then asked to be here on the panel by a student who's going to be shadowing with me vis-a-vis a program here at Duke, which I think is really phenomenal that people get access and the ability to sort of shadow along in real time with someone like me who sees patients. That's a big part of my job. I won't go too much into the many years of training that I've done, other than to say that it was many years. I think the key points are that I went to med school at UNC, then left and trained in Boston and came back to Duke to do my endocrine fellowship, and have been here on faculty for 11 years. Have really been at Duke for the greater part of the last 14. Some of that was training. And my passion, both clinically and in my research, is in type 2 diabetes and obesity. And I'm specifically focused on how we can help special populations gain access to health systems and navigate health systems, and also be a part of programming that is designed for their specific needs. And really lifestyle programming is what I focus most on. I'm also very interested in disparities in care, all the way from patient level and system level to what we can do from a policy perspective, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But I'll stop there and let others say a few words about themselves. Oh, that's for me, okay.
Set it up.
Yeah.
So hi, I'm Ann West. I am an associate professor in of neurobiology in the medical school, and I'm also the associate director of the MD-PhD or MSTP program here at Duke, which is a program that takes people who are just like me and sends them through both medical school and graduate school to get an MD and a PhD together at the same time. And that's the path that I followed. I was always interested in science. I was always interested in the brain, and as an undergrad, I studied insect behavior, actually. So we looked at insects and how they interacted with their environment. I was at Cornell, and it was very, very sort of naturalistic biology environment, which was great. But somewhere along the way, I decided that probably people were a little bit more interesting than cockroaches, which is what I worked on at the time, although cockroaches are really interesting. But I decided then to go to medical school, but was still interested in science, so from the beginning pursued both degrees simultaneously. When I finished getting my MD and PhD, though, I figured out that I really loved science more than anything, and so I went and did a postdoc. I didn't do further clinical training, and then I came here on faculty 13 years ago. But I remain involved, obviously very interested in translational neuroscience, and remain involved with encouraging others to follow a similar path and to do science that's relevant to human health. We'll get to talk more about, I think it's too much to introduce yourself, your path, and your obstacles, and your pearls of wisdom. So how about we just start with path and then go from there.
Thank you. I'm Nyote, Calixte, and I am Director of Academic Engagement for the Natural and Quantitative Sciences here at Duke, and that is through the Academic Advising Center. I am technically trained as a PhD chemist and received my PhD from Louisiana State University in chemistry. And so I am very much a science nerd, an analytical chemist, and so very much started as a separation scientist before moving on to next generation sequencing work that was part of my PhD work. And now what I do here at Duke is working with undergraduates who have interests in the STEM paths here and help them try to interrogate that path, connect intentionally to the scientific community at Duke, and to be able to foster any sense of scientific inquiry, as well as engagement curricularly and extracurricularly through like research and things like that.
Wonderful. I think we'll go next to an obstacle you faced in your career or a time when you felt undervalued or that you needed to make some change in order to feel valued in your work.
I'll start. I think as an African American woman, especially an African American woman in STEM, I hold somewhat of the burden of having a double bind, being both a minority and also being a woman. And so that can have its own particular challenges. Sometimes I grapple with in my environment, wherever it might be, whether at a scientific conference or whatever the case may be, any assumptions that are tethered to those two groups, whether it be my competency as a scientist because I am a woman, or my demeanor and interpersonal interactions because I'm a black woman, and there's a stereotype that women of color, especially black women, can be angry or things like, so really trying my best efforts at many different points to serve as a de-bias by example. So having that burden of having to de-bias people's opinions about me through, an example can sometimes be an obstacle because it has me focusing more on what people's perception of me will be and less upon just being my natural self sometimes in an environment.
So I will now say something heretical. So I've been in science for 30 years at this point, and it's been great. From the beginning of my career, there was an observation in every environment that I was in that there were many different kinds of people, that there were many different kinds of people in science. I saw many different kinds of people as my mentors and as my colleagues. I attended a Women in Science conference when I was an undergraduate, where I met an amazingly wonderful woman who told me her history, and her history was different from mine. I mean, her history was that she wasn't allowed to have a faculty position at Cornell because her husband was on the faculty and they didn't do that kind of thing. But that was 30 years before me. And, and she was telling this story to a group of people who already saw women on the faculty and already envisioned themselves as being on the faculty. So I went on into a really prestigious program where I had lots of women mentors, and I had lots of different kinds of mentors. People, again, there was a great respect for diversity. In my first year class in medical school, the first thing we did was have discussions about diversity and how we support diversity and how we can support different groups. And somebody said something offensive in a class, and the whole class rose up and had a big protest in the middle of the class. And so I have lived my whole life in what I felt was a really supportive, active, aware environment. And I've been really happy about that, and I try to continue that. I try to do everything. I'm very purposeful about how I continue to look at diversity in the environment that I'm in now. I've been active in trying to, for instance, talk with people. We've been doing training for my department on implicit bias, and we do this all the time. It's sort of a constant effort. But I just recently read this book called Lab Girl. Maybe some of you have seen this. It's a wonderful book by this woman, Hope Jar, and she's a botanist. And it's really a book about her passion for science. She's a couple of years younger than me. She's almost the same age. But as I read through the book, she is infused with this feeling that the whole world is against her, that she has all these interactions where people treat her differently because she's a woman. Now, I don't deny that all this happened to her. This is how she envisioned it. But I guess the thing that I want to say to you is that that's not what happened to me, and that's not how I envisioned my life. And there are things that happen all the time where I'm down, where I've been put down, where things have gone wrong, where you need help. That's absolutely positively the case. But I don't know that it's that there's necessarily nothing that's ever been done, or this is a problem that's never been considered, or this is something that's different than it needs to be different than it used to be. I've been in this for 30 years, going to women in science conferences, all of which have been meaningful, and for every generation, redoing that information constantly is important for each individual. And again, not everybody's had the perfect experience. There's no question about that, and we need to keep trying to do better. But I guess that's the line that I wanted to put out there is to say that there is a lot of goodwill, and there has been a lot of goodwill, and we can always do better.
I'm going to take this off, I think, because it's, okay.
We're good.
Yeah, so I've had 1,000 challenges. I think for some I'm really grateful because I think challenges are how you grow, especially if you have the ability to ask the critical questions about how you can grow after a challenge. So I could talk about a lot of things. I've had very similar experiences being a Black woman in science and in medicine. I routinely am called nurse, and I have, people who are 20 years my junior on my teams in the hospital, and patients defer to those individuals as being the lead of the team, and I routinely have had to sort of think about ways to respectfully correct that thinking. But I think the one thing that I'll talk about, because I could spend a lot of time in other areas, is the many different hats that I think each individual, in particular that I hold, and how that it's been challenging over time to reinvent myself. So I told you that training is many years, and it has been for all of us, I think. But the one major challenge that I had to sort of navigate was becoming a mom, and actually probably becoming a wife and then a mom. I'm very fortunate. I work in endocrine, which is very heavily dominated by women, and so I've had a lot of support along the way. I've also had very strong women in my family and in my life who have projected that it's doable. But it was challenging to figure out how to hold the hat of being a doctor and being a researcher and being a wife and being a mom. And I'm here to tell you that it's very doable. I think one of the things that we don't do well is express to individuals that it is really hard, and that you're not the same person, that you can't sort of be all, I guess, and that you have to sort of figure out how to manage all of the pieces of yourself. But those pieces of me are critically important because they help me be a better person, and I think they help me to think critically about what I do with patients and what I do in my family and what I do in my research. And it's been really fun, too. Some days when I feel like, oh, this didn't go very well, or I have to sort of apologize to that person, or I miss like a really critical email that I was supposed to get back to someone, and then I go pick my kids up and they're like, Mom, you would never guess, we found my oldest son yesterday was like, we found a turtle, and it was like totally alive, and it was on the playground, and I was like, tell me more. These pieces of who you are and who you become are so important, and so I just want to leave you with the fact that don't be scared of that. I think that it is a long time, and it's a lot of years, and it becomes sort of overwhelming to think, how am I going to fit it all in? But the fact of the matter is the pieces do fit together, and I think the key piece is having someone in your life that helps you to work through the challenges and figure out how to make yourself better after them. So that's sort of my piece of wisdom. But the other challenges of being a woman, of being of a minority race group, for those of you that are in ethnic groups that are underrepresented, those are additional challenges that add to who you are as a person, and can make it challenging to move through.
That question about work-life balance was actually on here. So I'd love to hear Dr. Calixte and Dr. West's thoughts on how they balance that.
I am still figuring that out. You see, I have an experiment going on as we speak, and my wife is getting ready to shift again. And so I will have to reevaluate that again. But I will say that one of the things that I have learned as a wife and a mom is that, I've actually told a student this the other day, is that kind of the fairy tale kind of conception of like marriage and this person is your end all be all and all that jazz. And I love my husband to the moon and back, but I realized that in part of that, he can't be the source of my happiness. And that was a really big lesson for me to learn in terms of how I navigated through all of these different roles that I had to play. It's unfair to saddle a person with such a responsibility. And so once I came to that realization, I think that it made navigating through all these different hats that I had to wear much easier to balance, because I wasn't looking for this person to be the source of everything. Second, I think with motherhood kind of coming into that dynamic, learning that I had to give myself grace, and with that grace allowed me to be a lot more flexible in terms of, oh, is my house clean? Or, oh, did I wash, clothes today? Or whatever the case may be, just again, balance. And saying to myself, it's okay if this didn't get done. Or, that can be done tomorrow. It's not the end of the world. And now as I'm approaching motherhood of 2, I'm thinking to myself, how can I integrate systematically some things into my schedule that will allow it to run more efficiently so that it can almost be on autopilot for some things. So I'm reorganizing parts of my house, and I'm putting up little message boards and, various places where that information can be stored and kind of, compacted so that, oh, I don't have to go searching for this memo about this. I don't have to go and search for a timeline or a calendar for that, really upping my organization. And I think that that's how I've been trying to adapt to work-life balance. I haven't mastered it, but I think that knowing that it's a continual process has been helpful, and knowing that I will have to reevaluate again very soon is also having me think strategically about what to anticipate.
So I also have kids. I have 2 kids who are now 11 and 16, and I'm also married. So have been through this, you'll make it. It's awesome. And I think actually what I love is your story that you told. And I think as much of a challenge as it is that you have to become very organized to have kids, they're also this wonderful joy. And they become the source of happiness for you. You have to somehow or other have some feeling that you can get up and be motivated and excited in the morning. And sometimes it isn't the laugh. Sometimes the laugh's kind of a drag. But your kids are awesome. So it's a real joy and a benefit. It's something that you have in your life that you look at this and you have to be aware of and realize that wonderfulness in the midst of all the challenges. When they're little babies, they're great because, of course, they're so cute. And so they make you, they naturally evoke that in your brain as we think about brain wiring. You're naturally evoked to want to care for them, which is a wonderful thing. So that's a great joy. And figuring it out, well, other people have other things they have to figure out. Some people have marriages where they live in 2 different cities and they have to commute back and forth. Some people have a sick parent that they have to care for. Some people live in war-torn countries. I mean, people have all sorts of things in their lives that make it difficult to achieve whatever their goals are. So if your challenge in achieving your goal is having these, wonderful, joyful little beings in your life that you have to care for, it's in some way it's a great privilege to have that as a challenge. Now, I do think that one thing that's worth pointing out is that there are challenges that fall differently depending on whether which parent you are. So all parents have challenges, and I have to say, in my department, all the men have kids and all the women have kids. So it's not that uncommon, and then there's a whole group that don't have kids. But it's just as common for men as women to have kids, and they have to deal with the same issues in terms of getting them to school and this kind of thing. But there are some issues that fall disproportionately on women. So, for instance, women become pregnant, and that's not easy. So that doesn't happen to men. So this is just a fact of life. It's not a discrimination in the sense of something that people purposely do to hurt you in your career development. But it simply is something that's different. Men and women don't equally have to do with the issues of pregnancy in terms of the time that it happens in your career. And if you're going through and doing medical training, for instance, thinking about the timing of when you can actually manage to be pregnant and maybe be home with your baby for a certain amount of time. It's not trivial to figure out where to do that in the process of medical training. So this does influence the lives of men and women somewhat differently in terms of these specific issues. The good news on that side is those are issues that can be addressed in a policy way. For instance, with respect to how residency programs deal with residents who might need to be on maternity leave, that's a policy issue that they can figure out how to deal with at the level of the residency program. So this is something that can be managed to make sure that it doesn't impede your career. And the deal is these things happen. People go out and they look at the data, and for instance with physician scientists, they see the impact that having children has because it happens at the beginning of women's careers when they're trying to be physician scientists. And so therefore there's programs that will say, for instance, give extra years worth of funding to get people through that time so that you can catch up and then move on. It's not a criticism of your productivity, it simply is a biological fact.
I have just a couple of practical things. The first is, I think we all need to learn how to be forgiving of ourselves. And so when stuff doesn't go right, a lot of times I'll just say, well, I didn't plan it that way, or a child gets sick, or a parent gets sick, or a pet gets sick. All these things happen, and you just have to be able to forgive yourself and then to move on and figure out how to regroup. I have a plaque on my desk that says life is all about how you handle plan B, right? Like plan A is pretty simple and easy. You can put it on a piece of paper, it looks like you can follow it. But the real deal, the real way to get through is to figure out how you manage plan B, and you just have to be flexible. The second thing I'll say is that I don't believe in work-life balance, I believe in work-life harmony. Generally speaking, one area, home or work, is spinning out of control, and so as long as neither is out of control and they're within orbit, I feel successful in that way, and that's the truth. And then the last thing I'll say is that in whatever you can outsource. So I never outsource my children in terms of the time I spend with them, but there are times when I have to ask for help. Can you pick up this, my son, or I have two boys, cleaning the house, doing the lawn, things where when you think about your free time and the value, and if you're in a space where you have some additional funds that you can put to it, it's worth doing. And the quick story is that for years my husband was like, I think we need help in the house and cleaning, and I was like, no, I can do this, and he said, what are you talking about? And I was like, my mom had 6 kids, and she was an obstetrician, and she cleaned the house, and we didn't have a maid, and we're gonna do this. And my husband said, he's like, okay, he's very understanding, he's a psychiatrist. Being married to a mental health provider, and he just rode along with me in the disaster zone, and I said to him, so finally our second child was born, and I said, oh no, I can't do this. And I talked to my mom, who's a very strong person, and I said, yeah, we kind of decided we need some help, or we're gonna get maid service. And I said, I feel so bad, you were able to do it, Mom. I don't know, I feel bad that I can't do it. She said, what are you talking about? We had a maid, we had somebody to help clean the house years ago. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, you don't remember such and such? I said, no. I said, what? I've been holding out for this dream. I've done this for myself for years, and you're telling me now I could have given up 4 years ago? So again, I say, where you can outsource. It has made a huge difference in our family. And if you can't in certain areas, then do the small things to help. Ask for help.
My maid is coming next week.
It's life-changing.
I want to switch gears a little bit to another form of children, which is students. I know you all work with students. Dr. Calixte, I want to start with you because I know you work in the advising center and you do a lot of one-on-one with students. And so my question is, how do you see struggles with inclusion affecting the students that you work with? Do you see it?
Yes. So the thing about Duke students is that you guys all come from very high achieving backgrounds, or else you wouldn't be here, right? So you guys are very accomplished, very high achieving, coming from some of the best high schools across the country and even the world. And what that does when you get here is that it puts you in this mindset of now competition. And so I get lots of students who come into my office who are saddled with the burden of competing against one another. And what that does is that it actually, you know, and psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, many people can attest that this actually does a very negative effect for a lot of different students. Instead of you performing at your highest level, instead of you being able to come in and really achieve the way that you have been doing for years leading up to your matriculation to Duke, many students are actually overwhelmed by the pressure and whatever other burdens that are associated with that, and actually end up performing poorly. And then those students therein are kind of in a cycle of now trying to play catch up and now trying to fix the bad semester. And one of the things that I really try to push for students in these meetings is, and I don't know where this quote comes from, but I use it so much, like I feel like I take credit for it, but it's not mine. But, you know, basically comparison is the thief of joy. And students end up miserable in their first, you know, several semesters here because they've been so overwhelmed with comparing one another. Oh, well, you know, the class average was this, my roommate got this on the test, I only got this, so that means I think, you know, they're projecting grades, all sorts of things. And it really robs students of the experience in this very unique moment that they're in. I loved my undergraduate experience and was very happy with it. I mean, there were times where it was rough, but overall, I really had such a communal environment. And when I look at the struggle that students have when in these one-on-one meetings, it really presses upon me that there needs to be a different narrative around achievement and even help-seeking behavior and exploration. Many students will say to me, well, I'm persisting in STEM or, you know, thinking about a STEM degree because I was always good at science, and so I'm going to just be a science major because I think that that's what I'm good at. And I've had to tell students, you know, I did chemistry because I loved it. And there were times where I didn't get grades that didn't necessarily indicate that I was very good at being a chemist, right? But I loved it. And that's what pushed me forward, you know, in those moments of, you know, I got a C on an orgo midterm. Oh, you know, woe is me. I'm not going to change my major now. But, you know, that really affects students in their perception of themselves, right? They want to preserve this very positive self-concept. And so anything that makes them feel like, oh, I can't do this, or it's negative, they really want to push away from that. And so I just try to encourage students in those one-on-one meetings to really be passionate about what it is that you're exploring and to really think about your unique narrative. What is your individual story? And it doesn't have to look like everybody else's. You don't have to compare yourself to everyone else in order to have an impactful and a meaningful experience here at Duke. And you also don't have to be a STEM major to go to medical school. Maybe 30 years ago.
Anthropology.
You know, maybe 20, 30 or 40 years ago, maybe you needed to be a STEM major to be a doctor, but long gone is that necessity, right? So pursue the things that you want to pursue and be happy about the narrative that you're creating. And first and foremost, don't compare yourself to anyone else. Make, what you want to do the center of what you're focusing on and less about the comparison culture that you're immersed in. And I think students would be a lot happier with their time. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I have seen this, you raised the question initially asking, have you seen people have issues as students around this issue of inclusion? And so mostly realize I work mostly with students at a level one beyond where you guys are. So graduate students and medical students, so they've already completed their undergrad and going on into STEM fields, either in medical school or graduate school. So they're a little bit they're a little bit older, this kind of thing. But nonetheless, that transition is still quite challenging, and there's still this issue. I agree absolutely. Of people are very good, they're going on into postgraduate training. They must be super smart, but then the other guy is super smart too. So then they get nervous about that, and it causes people, I think, often to regress to looking for people who are similar to you and trying to sort of unite together. We've seen this in our first year graduate school classes. Actually, cliques emerge, and we're like, oh my goodness, I remember my medical school class, my first year medical school class. I felt like it was back in high school. It's like there's cliques in medical school class. And I think it's a response to anxiety and wanting to be with other people who make you feel comfortable. But sometimes what happens is there aren't a lot of people who are really similar to you, and this is at least outwardly. And so there was a story of a person who was in our graduate training program who came from a very different background from most of the other students. And something really bad happened to this person, and they really struggled with it. And one of the reasons it was so hard to struggle with is the person didn't feel like anybody else in the class shared her personal experience. And so if she told you what happened, everybody would say, oh, that doesn't happen to people that I know. And so this is very terrifying for her. And we went through a lot of working and talking with her, but the best day that she and I ever had was one day when we went out to lunch. And I said, tell me about what you're doing in the lab. And she just went off, and she just nerded out on science. She said, this is the thing, what we share is not what we look like, or maybe where we went to school. What we share at that level, what we share in an academic environment is our love of whatever our field is. We talked about G protein coupled receptor signaling and phosphorylation of proteins, which is really exciting if you're us. And so, yeah, it's not really. And we just had this wonderful time around that. And so I think, when you come back to this idea about telling your narrative, which I thought was a beautiful line, when I look at her, I say, your narrative is that you love science. And if you make that your narrative, then you'll find all sorts of other people around you who are just exactly like you. And you can share that. You can't share necessarily everything in your life. We all have different histories. And by the way, that personal history of who she is, it's very important to her who she is. And I don't want her to not be who she is. She's a wonderful, exciting person. But what we share is our love of this academic venture. And I think you guys are unique and special and wonderful in this way of being in an academic environment, of finding those kind of connections. So I think the idea is don't let identity get in the way of finding commonality with others around issues that are beyond yourself.
Yeah, I agree. I will say I do think it is incumbent upon those of us who are working and creating and living in environments like Duke that we do have diverse populations. I'll tell you that I trained in an environment where I was one of three African American trainees in a training program that had 60 people each year. And it was really lonely. It was lonely, okay, to sort of look out amongst my colleagues and friends and feel very close to some people, but feel like I couldn't talk about certain parts of my experience. And so for the few people that I found on faculty that understood the core of me in different ways, it was really enriching. And so I think that's incredibly important. I see that, so I work mostly with medical students and then with house staff, but I also work with a few undergrads as well, and try to make myself available to have conversations that sometimes are really specifically important because individuals and I share a common bond in being African American or being women. And it's transformative sometimes for people I've had medical students who've been on the wards or residents and interns who've been on the wards that have said, it feels really good to be able to speak in a situation where I can be free and not think about what the judgment's going to be or the misunderstanding. Because that loneliness that individuals feel and that isolation that individuals feel gets in the way of their creativity and gets in the way of comfort and also gets in the way of our recruitment of those individuals to stay at Duke and to enrich the Duke environment. And so, I'm a part of a number of different groups within the medical center that have been very focused on not just recruiting but retaining individuals because retention is a huge problem. And I think that a lot of that conversation is around identifying ways that each individual can find the person or people who are similar in experience, not just in color but in experience. And for some, it's that bond with science that then allows them to be more comfortable to be able to say, I'd like to talk about these other things that have nothing to do with G protein coupled receptors or diabetes and more about what my lived experience has been and how we can make that better. And the last thing I'll say is that this is not an option of like, should we or should we not do this? We are in the midst of many crises where this is required, in my opinion. And I think that there is lots of policy change, lots of things that we can do to build into environments the ability for individuals to come and feel warm and feel welcome and feel comfortable.
I do have one little exercise to drill down with a little bit more specificity my original point. Everyone close your eyes real quick. Envision a scientist. We're going to think phenotypically here. So what this scientist looks like. Does everybody have their picture of a scientist? Now, open your eyes. Who all envisions someone who is white? Raise your hand high. Okay, so about 50%, 60% of the room. Okay. How many envisioned a male? Almost the same percentage, right? So this is the reason why diversity and inclusion is important. And it ties back to that comparison culture, right? So students who are coming into an environment here at Duke who want to do something, they want to be a scientist, they want to be a physician, they want to be in this space. But then not only are they coming here with this comparison narrative and enveloping them, right? But now they also have a predominant perception that they do not look like the status quo in terms of what a scientist or physician looks like. And so that adds an additional layer of burden to the anxieties and the pressures that are enveloping them in their academic environment. You can also liken that to being one of very few students of color in their classes, especially as they get to higher level STEM classes. So these, while we want to make sure that identity doesn't cripple students, we can't take the burden that saddles many students with off of the table in terms of everything that they are negotiating about themselves. Because we understand, again, from the literature that when you have a negative stereotype or a negative association with something that you identify with, it has a direct correlation to your performance, which is why many researchers even talk about putting demographic information at the ends of examinations just to be able to ensure that students can perform to their utmost ability. These are things that we cannot, negate, right? So when we're talking about this comparison narrative, that's one challenge that all Duke students encounter. But then that additional piece of being one of very few persisting towards something where the majority of society doesn't view you as an indication of what that looks like adds another burden. So I just wanted to do that exercise real quick.
So that's actually a really good segue towards my next question, which is when people of minorities and women and other underrepresented groups find themselves against these roadblocks, how do we help them maintain their course in STEM? How do we help them even enter STEM in the first place if that's something that they're afraid to do?
I'll go first. I think that the way to increase diversity in STEM in particular, there's no one way. I think that it's a multi-level process, and it requires sort of intervention on many different levels, and many different age groups as well. We talk a lot about pipeline, so a lot about how you first spark interest, and then how you nurture that interest, and then how I think you channel that interest into true focus. And so I think that's really important. I will again highlight the fact that retention, so not just getting people interested, but actually helping them to maintain interest and focus and complete programming is really critically important. And I think it's been, the focus has been a little less on retention than it probably should be. Because we have many students who start and are initially interested and then fall off, and so we have this decrement at the end. We start with many more and we end with many less. And one example that, of ways that we can do this has already been mentioned in earlier, I think, by somebody who talked about not having to major in a science. And I was an anthropology major at Yale. I absolutely loved it. I was a social-cultural anthropology major and went into medicine. And whenever I'm counseling, I'm always telling people that story, and they're like, I didn't know this. And so, I think, again, starting early, I think retention is important, but I also think exposure is really important. And sort of normalizing the fact that, yeah, it takes a lot of years to do these things that we do, but you also live your life along that way, and you have experiences, and you have fun, and you laugh a lot. So that exposure to people like us, I think, in doing the job is really important. I'll also say that I think it is incredibly important for us as an institution to not just have meetings and say that we need to diversify applicants, that we need to be focused on how we make Duke a more diverse place, but that we actually have benchmarks for how people are actually making that happen. And to not say, well, go out into your division and, try to, interview more women, and then in surgery they're like, well, there are no women. And, for those of us like myself, I'm like, what are you talking about? There are no women. There are women in surgery. You have to find them, right? So having people actually put a plan to paper and have benchmarks on how they're going to do that. And then, you know what? If you do everything that you can to try to recruit and you don't find the person, then that's okay. But you have to make a concerted effort, and we have to track those efforts. And it needs to be clear, that the effort needs to be real and true. And I'll stop there.
Two of the things that you sort of hit on, just to split it out and maybe emphasize two different sides of this. One is, what can we do for students who are going through the process, for the students themselves? And I do think that frequently there is this need to identify with a group, and you may do that sort of naturally. You may sort of, as we said, you shut your eyes and you envision someone, and you see yourself as that person that you envisioned, and so there's sort of no issue. But for some groups, there isn't as much of that. You may view yourself as a member of a group that's not represented, even if that's not a group that's on a list of paper. Like, we have certain underrepresented minority groups, for instance, that if you qualify in this category, you can put that on an NIH grant. But many people identify with groups that they may not see around them. And if you are part of that, I do think it's important that we find ways to bring people together. That this idea that you need to connect emotionally with others who have a shared experience is a really important thing, that it helps each individual move through the process. But there's also this idea of the larger community, as you were pointing to, and a lot of what makes a difference is who's out there. So here's my example. Again, when I was an MD PhD student, there were more men than women in the program. It's been that way for a long time. But of course, it's not that there were no other women. So this is one of the issues that's a little bit different as we talk about what it means to be a different kind of minority. It does have to do with how many people of your type there are within the group. And there's been studies done on this, and it doesn't have to be equal. Once you pass 30% as a minority set of a group, then you're usually not singled out as being significantly different. And if you look in different fields of the sciences, that will be different. If you look in medicine versus science, it will be different. So different groups are going to have this issue differently in different places. But there's sort of some threshold you need to pass, so seeing a certain number of people. So when I was a student, it was clear there were other women, but it was less. And but that was among the students, and the question was, well, how many people have gone through this path before? And at the time, Nancy Andrews, who was the dean here for many years, was at Harvard where I was, and she said, I'm going to have this dinner for the women MD PhDs. And it was like a joke, oh, there's going to be like 5 people there, my friends will have like a table, and we go there, and there's 128 people there. And Nancy has a list of all of the MD PhD clinician science women in the Harvard hospitals. And it was a huge list. And the question was, well, why didn't I ever see these people before? And you know why? Because they're running a clinical practice, and they're doing research, and they have families, and they don't have time to hang out at all these events that we have. So they're out there, but they're working. So the question was, how do you connect people to that? And one of the things that comes on the flip side of that is, I have many friends who, I have a student of mine who went through my lab, but she's African American, and she went to grad school at Hopkins. And she would always get asked to do these things where she'd get asked to go out and talk to other students so that she could recruit them into these programs. Well, that was great for recruitment, but the thing was, after a while, she said to me, well, I think people are asking me if I can, maybe I should be a writer, or maybe I should be a teacher. And I said, Kelly, did you ever think that maybe you should be a postdoc? Maybe that you should go on in science? Maybe that you should stay in academics? Did anybody ever say that to you? Like, she was so tasked with going out and recruiting more people into the field, that she couldn't work on developing her own career. So it's this issue of recruitment versus retention, and it often hits specific individuals. So although as much as we need to recruit, it's important to protect people who are already in the field, because growing her up as a scientist is key to the future of science, because we got to get the numbers up high enough that you can look at this and say, oh, look, there's a critical mass of these people who've been very, very successful. And I'm very pleased to say that after I said, you ever thought of being a postdoc? That she was a postdoc. Yeah. And I was so happy that she went on. And I said, thank goodness somebody, said to her, maybe this is what you want to do. So I think there are different issues. The point is for individuals versus groups, and how you might talk to somebody that you're connected with personally versus policies that a university might make.
So, as was previously mentioned, there's lots of different interventions and there's lots of different levels at which that intervention can occur. For brevity, I'll go ahead and just talk about higher education, since that's where Duke students are. I think that one of the things that we have been examining as part of what brought me to Duke is looking at instruction. And many people will say, well, why instruction? The information is information. Biology is biology. Central dogma is central dogma. SN1, SN2 reactions are SN1, SN2 reactions. That's chemistry. It is what it is. But one of the things that we're starting to learn in our space is that there is a way in which you can teach information that will either teach it to a very specific subset of students, or it will teach the information broadly enough for all students in the class to be able to receive and understand. And what we're trying to encourage departments to be more cognizant of is how instruction is being delivered, right? Because we feel like this is an important component for how everyone can come to the table. So I talked about how high achieving Duke students are. And they're coming from schools all over the world, to come here. There's no reason why a student who wants to major in a STEM discipline will get here from a high achieving school and be valedictorian or salutatorian of their high school and then get here and fail. It's incumbent upon us as educators and people within the scientific arena to be able to look at what we are doing, to be able to convey that information to students and say, are we teaching to everyone in our lecture? Or are we teaching specifically to students who have seen this information before? Or teaching to students who have whatever sort of background and leaving those other students who don't have that information, leaving them at the margins? And so I think that that's one of the things that we're trying to do here in the undergraduate sector, is to really look at introductory courses, because they've gotten a bad representation, right? Gateway courses are regarded as weedouts, and unfortunately that's not what these courses should be. They're foundational, and they allow students to be able to enter into STEM disciplines with a very strong foundation to be able to take that information, whether it be through math, chemistry, whatever the case may be, to be able to go on and do deeper depth in their fields of interest and study. If these students don't have that, then they're less likely, and so attrition becomes high. And unfortunately, this happens with underrepresented students the most. And so what we want to do here is we want to, we have brilliant scientists as faculty lecturers. We want to sit down with them and say, hey, have you thought about how this introductory class is going, right? How can we think about innovative ways that bring in students' cultural, ways in which they understand, information, or broadly teaching this subject where there's application-based, where now these students can apply information real time and think about their lived experiences as a result of the information that they're gathering. And this will definitely take time, but I know Dean Valerie Ashby and Dean Arlie Petters are working on things where we want to reimagine the curricula here at Duke within STEM so that all students are equipped with the knowledge and accompanying that excitement that they bring to that knowledge and being able to persist through. And then be able to get on to completing, so not just matriculation, but graduation with STEM degrees. And I think that from a higher education perspective is what we're going to be focusing on here at Duke.
All right, with that note on the future of education, I think we're going to open up for questions. Anybody have them?
So within the STEM fields, there's, I think, the greatest potential for higher income, for a lot of the really, goals that a lot of people set, particularly high achieving students. I think there's also the issues within equality within that inclusion. So I know a lot of women have experienced things like you sort of become the housekeeper of your office, or you're the person that goes to fetch coffee, and there are assumptions that come, even though there is inclusion within a group, that there are still some stereotypes within that group, things like salary, compensation, whatnot. I'm wondering what you may have done individually to sort of combat those situations in your professional lives.
So for me, one of the things that was very apparent is that obviously I have a very youthful appearance. And so with that, being a woman of color with a PhD in chemistry, one of the things that I found very often was that it was assumed that I was just Miss, or that I was an office staff person, or things like that. And that's perfectly fine, but I worked very hard to become Dr. Calixte, and so it was very imperative for me to have to assert in my narrative, yeah, my name is Dr. Calixte, and having to spend, several months correcting colleagues or students to be able to understand that while it might be cool for you to let students call you by your first name, that's not a space or privilege that I operate in where I can do that, because it is often more assumed that I don't have my PhD than not. And so those were some of those different sorts of spaces that I had to sometimes navigate, as one specific example.
I have upfront seen the salary thing play out, and it's very complicated. It's not as simple as, oh, you're 6'2", I'm going to give you more money. If there's this study that's been shown that CEOs are taller than other people, and it's $879 per inch of height or something like that. I forget what it is, something absurd. But in fact, twice I've seen situations where salaries were reviewed within a department, an academic department, and it was revealed that there was in fact a difference between men and women. And in that particular case, in both cases, in fact, salaries were readjusted. Now you can ask, why did it happen? The response is a good response, right? It's a response that says, hey, I don't think the situation's right, we reviewed it, fixed it. But how does it emerge? And that's actually a very difficult thing to say. Whether this is because of cultural expectations in how people behave, or whether it's just a coalescence of probabilities that it simply happens that way. It's really hard to know. So I don't know that you can expect everything to always be equal all the time. What you can expect is for people to care and be purposeful about reviewing such situations and correcting them if they're identified. So that would, I guess that's the expectation. Not that everyone thinks the way that I do and immediately is looking out for me and will make sure that everything is always the same for me as it is for everybody else, but that if I bring something up, that it will be addressed seriously. And again, what I have to say, I actually do feel optimistic about this. I've had situations where I've been in, very recently, in situations where I will raise a concern about bias, and it's always responded to very well. It doesn't mean that it was perfect, but at least it's progress.
Yeah, so this is a huge problem and a huge issue. I want to impart a couple of different thoughts, because I think for those in the audience who are young and you're just starting on these journeys, there's a couple things that are really important to realize. The first is that nobody will advocate for you like you will advocate for yourself. A few people maybe who are mentors or who are invested in you, hopefully in a positive way, but nobody is going to think about it. And so it's really critically important that at the core of it, that you are always alert to what's going on around you, and that you think about it, okay? So when you're looking for a new job, when you are up for promotion, or even working towards promotion, that you're asking the question on a regular basis, am I on track? You know, what are my colleagues doing around me? Are things happening that are fair? And not in a negative way, but in a way where you're advocating for yourself, okay? Number one. Number two, you have to be able to understand your own self-worth. And you have to be able to believe that at your core, you are worth the time and effort that someone should put into developing you and promoting you and giving you what the due is in terms of salary or space or staff. I work with a number of individuals who do not value themselves, and so they allow other people to devalue them, and that is, it's a problem. So if you have a problem with valuing yourself, if you don't see yourself as being worthy, or you're nervous about asking for more money because I don't know, because maybe other people work harder than I do, you need to find someone in your life that can help you and remind you of that. If that's your family, if that's a mentor, to say, no, you do excellent work, you're valued, you bring something to the organization that people should value, okay? The third thing is that, you know, a lot of times in my life I kind of had my head down. I told you the path was long. I became a wife, I became a mom. And at different points I would say, well, maybe a promotion this year, but I'm not quite sure because, you know, looking at all the sort of different requirements, maybe a couple years from now I'll be ready. And I kind of had my head down. And I had other people in my life who said, look up, you know, the time is now, you're ready. Okay, so having a mentor or someone in your life who is going to help push you to think about what those critical milestones should be in your career is really important, because you're not always going to have your head up. You're going to be doing the work. And so those yearly meetings, when you meet with an advisor, you meet with a mentor, you need to be saying, okay, here's the list of things I want to talk with you about. This has happened to me time and time again. I go into a meeting, and because my salary's covered, they're like, oh, you're good. I'm like, oh no, we are not good. Let's talk about promotion. Let's talk about where I am. Let's talk about salary. Let's talk about, you know, the vision I have for the next year. How do I increase my prominence in this area or that area? But only you as a person are going to do that consistently for yourself. So be your own self-advocate. And then the last thing I'll say is, whatever is happening around you, that is not written in stone. And many, many times people have told me, well, this is how we do it. And when I ask the question, I'm interested in learning why we do it that way. 9 times out of 10, the answer is because it's been done that way before. That's not written in stone. There's no Bible rule around that. And I say, not infrequently, I have an idea for how we could do this differently. I have an idea for why my path should be different, or I should be considered for this, or I should be considered for that. And it's really important that you help other people to understand that thinking outside of the box for you is what's best for you. And you know, you might ask for something and they say, and there's a practical reason why it can't happen, you know. Dr. Batch, you can't have this whole furniture office because we need space for everyone else, right? And so you have to be willing to compromise, but again, not a single person, besides maybe your mom, is going to advocate for you like you will for yourself.
Do we have time for one more?
We're done.
All right. Thank you guys so much.